Welcome and thank you for being here today. My name is Elena Hood, and I am presenting my dissertation exploring educators' perceptions and implementation of trauma-informed practices within one rural elementary school in San Diego County. Before I begin, I'd like to briefly provide an overview of today's presentation. First, I will discuss the problem statement. I will go into a literature overview. We will review the purpose statement and research questions, followed by the theoretical framework that guided the study, the methodology used, the findings, how those findings align with the literature, the implications and recommendations, the limitations of the study, and lastly, the distribution plan. The problem that motivated the study was the growing disconnect between the increasing prevalence of student trauma and educators' preparedness to respond effectively. Research has shown that trauma can significantly affect students' emotional regulation, behavior, relationships, and academic engagement. However, many educators report limited preparation for recognizing and responding to trauma-related behaviors and triggers. These challenges may be even more pronounced in rural schools where access to mental health resources, professional development, and implementation supports can be limited. My literature review was organized into 5 areas. First, I examined research on trauma and its impact on students. Second, I reviewed the benefits of trauma-informed practices and the role educators play. Third, I explored implementation challenges and barriers. Fourth, I examined effective trauma-informed strategies. And finally, I reviewed current findings and the future direction of research. Together, these areas highlighted the need to better understand how educators perceive and implement trauma-informed practices. The purpose of this qualitative, holistic, single case study was to explore how elementary educators in one rural school in San Diego County perceived and implemented trauma-informed practices across universal, targeted, and intensive levels of support. To guide the study, I developed 2 research questions. The first explored how educators perceived the relationship between trauma-informed practices, and the role of training in creating supportive learning environments. The second question explored how educators perceived the implementation of trauma-informed practices across tiers of support and the challenges that influenced their ability to foster supportive learning environments. The study was guided by the Creating, Supporting, and Sustaining Trauma-Informed Schools framework developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in 2017. I selected this framework because it conceptualizes trauma-informed practice as a tiered system of support that addresses the need of all students while recognizing that some students require increasingly targeted and intensive interventions. At Tier 1, the framework emphasizes universal supports such as relationship building, predictable routines, emotionally safe classrooms, and professional learning for educators. For Tier 2, it focuses on targeted supports for students who need additional behavioral, social emotional, or academic assistance. Tier 3 includes intensive, individualized interventions for students experiencing significant needs. Beyond the tiers themselves, the framework emphasizes the importance of system-level alignment, collaboration, and educator capacity to sustained trauma-informed implementation. This framework informed the development of not only the research questions, but guided data collection and analysis, and served as the lens through which findings were interpreted. Using this framework as a lens, I then explored how educators within this one rural school implemented trauma-informed practices across the tiers. This study employed a qualitative, holistic, single case study design. A qualitative approach was selected because it allowed for an in-depth exploration of educators' perceptions and experiences with trauma-informed practices within their real-world context. The case was bounded to one rural elementary school in San Diego County. The study site was a rural frontier school serving approximately 50 students from preschool through 8th grade. The school served an underserved student population and had limited access to mental health resources, making it an appropriate setting for examining trauma-informed implementation within this rural context. Participants included 4 educators representing different instructional roles and grade levels: a preschool teacher, a transitional kindergarten and kindergarten teacher, an upper elementary teacher, and a special education teacher. This allowed for multiple perspectives across the setting. Data was collected through semi-structured interviews, follow-up interviews, and classroom observations. Using multiple data sources supported triangulation and provided a more comprehensive understanding of how trauma-informed practices were perceived and implemented across the site. Once data was collected, I analyzed them using a multi-step coding process, which I outline on the following slide. Data analysis followed a systematic multi-step process. First, I conducted first cycle coding using in vivo, descriptive, and process coding methods to capture participants' language, actions, and experiences related to trauma-informed practice. From these initial codes, I developed a codebook that provided operational definitions and supported consistency throughout the analysis process. I then conducted second cycle pattern coding to identify broader relationships among the codes and organized them into categories. These categories were refined into 4 major themes that described how educators perceived and implemented trauma-informed practices within this school. Finally, I conducted cross-participant analysis to identify similarities and differences across educator experiences and instructional settings. To enhance trustworthiness, I used triangulation across interviews and observations, member checking, peer debriefing, and reflective journaling throughout the study. This analysis process resulted in 4 themes that address the research questions and describe how educators perceive and implemented trauma-informed practices. Analysis of interview and observation data resulted in 4 themes. Together, these themes describe how educators understood trauma-informed practice, interpreted student behavior, implemented supports, and navigated factors that influenced implementation within the rural school context. I will now discuss each theme in greater detail. The first theme revealed that participants consistently viewed emotional regulation as a prerequisite for learning. Across grade levels, educators described trauma as affecting students' ability to attend to, process information, and engage academically. Rather than viewing dysregulated behavior solely as a disciplinary concern, participants prioritized co-regulation, emotional support, and regulation strategies before returning students to academic tasks. The second theme reflected how participants interpreted student behavior. Educators consistently described behavior as communication rather than defiance. Participants emphasized identifying underlying emotional, developmental, or environmental factors before determining how to respond. Observations supported this finding, as educators frequently used validation, choice, and regulation supports before corrective interventions. The third theme highlighted the role of educator capacity and consistency. Participants described developing trauma-informed practices primarily through professional experience rather than sustained training. Educators also emphasized the importance of consistent responses across adults and settings. Findings further revealed how workload demands, emotional labor, and rural resource limitations influenced implementation. The fourth theme focused on the importance of classroom structures and routines. Participants consistently described predictability, clear expectations, calming spaces, and relationship-centered routines as essential components of trauma-informed practice. Observations documented these supports across classrooms through visual schedules, regulation spaces, movement opportunities, and proactive regulation instruction. To better understand the significance of the findings, I compared them to the existing literature reviewed in Chapter 1. The findings aligned strongly with previous research demonstrating that emotional regulation is a prerequisite for learning. Participants consistently described the need to address students' emotional and behavioral needs before meaningful academic engagement, which supports the work of Brunzell et al. And Watson et al. On trauma-informed educational environments. The study also reinforced research indicating that student behavior is often a manifestation of underlying trauma-related experiences rather than simply non-compliance or defiance. Participants frequently discussed the importance of understanding the reasons behind behaviors, which aligns with findings from Bilbray et al. And Firestone and Cruz regarding the impact of trauma on behavior and relationships. Consistent with the literature, participants reported limited formal preparation and relied heavily on professional experience and self-directed learning to implement trauma-informed practices. Finally, while participants demonstrated strong commitment to supporting students, implementation varied across classrooms due to differences in training, resources, and adult responses. This mirrors existing research from NCTSN that highlights the challenges of achieving consistent trauma-informed implementation without coordinated school-wide systems. Overall, this study confirms much of the existing literature while contributing a rural school perspective, highlighting how trauma-informed practices are often sustained through educator dedication rather than through organizational structures. The findings suggest that strengthening trauma-informed implementation requires action across multiple levels of the educational system. At the site level, I recommend establishing a school-wide trauma-informed framework and developing consistent adult response protocols. Participants frequently described variation in how adults responded to students' needs, suggesting a need for greater alignment, not only across the classrooms, but across staff members as well. For county-level professional development leaders, I recommend creating sustained training pathways that extend beyond one-time workshops and include ongoing coaching and implementation support. Participants consistently described learning trauma-informed practices primarily through experience rather than through professional learning structures. At the regional level, findings highlight the importance of expanding mental health partnerships and increasing access to behavioral supports, particularly within rural communities where resources may be limited. Finally, for classroom educators, I recommend continuing regulation-focused instructional practices and collaborative problem-solving approaches that support emotional safety while maintaining high expectations for student learning. Collectively, these recommendations are intended to strengthen implementation coherence, educator capacity, and the long-term sustainability of trauma-informed practices. As with all qualitative case studies, several limitations should be considered when interpreting these findings. First, the study was conducted within a single rural school setting, which means the findings are very context-specific and not intended to be broadly generalizable. Second, the study included 4 educator participants, allowing for depth of understanding, but limiting the range of perspectives represented. Third, observations occurred within a limited observation window and therefore captured only a snapshot of classroom practices. Fourth, my own researcher positionality may have influenced data interpretation. However, reflexive journaling, peer debriefing, and member checking were used to enhance trustworthiness. And finally, site restrictions prohibited saving audio recordings of interviews. To address this limitation, interviews were transcribed in real time, reviewed with participants, and triangulated with observational data. Despite these limitations, the study provided valuable insight into trauma-informed implementation. To ensure the findings inform practice beyond the study, I developed a multi-level distribution plan targeting key decision makers involved in implementation. At the site level, I will share findings through a professional development presentation focused on strengthening school-wide coherence and consistency in trauma-informed practices. At the county level, I will distribute an executive brief to professional development coordinators to support the design of sustained training pathways and implementation supports. Findings will also be shared with regional agencies through a summary brief highlighting rural implementation challenges and opportunities to strengthen mental health and behavioral supports. Finally, classroom educators will receive a practitioner-focused summary that emphasizes practical trauma-informed strategies and educator wellness considerations. All dissemination activities are planned for fall of 2026 and are intended to promote collaboration, strengthen implementation supports, and improve sustainability of trauma-informed practices in rural schools. Thank you.